The member for Warringah.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I rise to speak on the Competition and Consumer Amendment Fair Go for Consumers and Small Business Bill 2024. Consumer choice is incredibly important, essential, I would say. Markets work best when there is competition and choice. Markets also work best when everyone plays by the same rules. This is especially true for small business. Small businesses make up 97.5% of businesses in Australia. They are facing at the moment a perfect storm of ongoing high interest rates, high energy prices, staff shortages and a downturn in consumer confidence due to successive Reserve Bank interest rate rises. I know from talking to many small businesses in Warringah that right now many business owners wonder what the government is actually doing for them. The government needs to proactively support small businesses in adapting, innovating and maintaining productivity to survive these ongoing pressures and headwinds. To support small businesses, as they do for large business and multinationals. The figures are stark. Only 43% of small businesses are breaking even. On this front, the government has been slow to give small businesses as much support as they could given the current economic headwinds. For example, the instant asset write-off and decarbonisation grants legislation for small businesses was first debated in this place in October last year, but it has yet to pass the other pace and so has not become law. And yet the provisions in that legislation end in this current financial year. I have moved amendments and sought for the government to extend it because that is the stupidity of this situation. And so I urge the government again to consider extending those provisions. We only have 3 months to go on the current financial year. So I call on the government to think about its approach to small business. Policy process has been all over the place and really a bit piecemeal. The industrial relations reforms have just added more uncertainty and complexity to business owners, and this includes amendments put in the legislation such as the right to disconnect. I repeat, it's not how we want to make good, sober public policy. So the problem before the government is this. There are currently extensive delays in considering and resolving complaints made by consumers to the ACCC. The ACCC's latest annual report notes that it's not hitting its own targets for initial competition investigations completed within 3 months, nor in-depth competition investigations completed within 12 months. So it's fouling on its own metrics. So it begs the question, why is the government not looking at the issue of providing greater resources to the ACCC or auditing to ensure efficiencies as to why we are not meeting those metrics of investigating complaints and resolving complaints? To me, ensuring there is sufficient resources to the ACCC, if that is where the problem in relation to dealing with the caseload, that would be logical. So instead, the government is choosing a fairly different path to improving the complaints resolution process, essentially creating a priority triage process of complaints. So what this bill before us does is it sets out a complaints framework that allows designated entities, consumer and small business advocates, to bring evidence of significant or systemic market issues to the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission for consideration. And then the ACCC, in accordance to its own rules, must respond within a certain time frame to these designated entities. The bill establishes a designated complaints function, and the designated complainants will be organisations approved by the Minister. The Minister may limit the number of designated complainants in a time period, and in turn, the ACCC must reply to the designated complaint within 90 days with notice of the action, if any, they intend to take. So if we really part through the detail, we're getting a minister with a high level of, discretion to designate who are these designated complainants will be. And then, whilst the ACCC must reply within 90 days, they must investigate, they just reply. So it still isn't really progressing the problem of complaints actually getting resolved and investigated automatically. Of course, anyone or any other consumers or entity can still make general complaints to the ACCC. So really, if we can, boil this down to simple language, the government is proposing a triage and prioritisation process open to some in a designated complaint organisation. And the ACCC may assess general complaints and decide whether to publish details of any actions it has taken in response to those. So my concern is this is not automatically going to address the backlog or the caseload concerns from consumers and their complaints and how that is processed. And what we will see is an allocation of resource, I think, internally to these designated complainants. Now, the designated complainant can be a corporation, a person holding a particular position, such as a statutory officer, or an unincorporated association. So my understanding is that a small business and consumer advocacy organisations are what the minister really has in mind and is looking at being potential designated complainants. Whilst in principle that may well work, I think of organisations like Choice or, for example, COSBOA that represent a number of small businesses. In principle that may well work, but I am concerned about the criteria of those designated complainants and how that really then sidesteps the idea that all complaints and all small businesses and customers have that opportunity for, I guess, an equal process and equal avenue to the ACCC. The bill details approval criteria to ensure designated complainants genuinely represent the interest of consumers and small business. Genuinely represent, genuinely, that will be a little subjective, I think, and I am concerned that where organisations are fee for membership organisations, you are essentially providing an added reason for joining an organisation, because consumers and small businesses may well feel they then have access to a higher likelihood of a complaint being considered by the ACCC and resolved. So there's a little bit of a picking of favourites in this triage and prioritisation process, and I have raised with the Minister my concerns about how this is sort of shifting the opportunity to have complaints considered by the ACCC. So I do have the issue that we don't want to supersede the ACCC's central role, which is responding to complaints by consumers. And I accept that often consumer complaints will come in bulk if there are repeated behaviours that are coming to light, and organisations like Choice may well be the right body to bring forward that bulk of complaints by consumers. But that's not always the case. And then the question of threshold and willingness to address certain consumer complaints is, I think, one of the challenges for the ACCC. So I am prepared to give the government the benefit of the doubt on this bill, hoping that this will provide some better pathway to resolution of consumer complaints. But I do feel we need, I will be presenting and moving an amendment to ensure we have a review clause in the legislation to ensure that it is working properly. We don't want a situation that results that in a couple of years' time we have essentially the ACCC triage and prioritisation process where they are favouring the complaint process through these designated complainants but ignoring complaints from consumers and customers. And so I think it's important that we keep an eye on that, and this place is where we need to be able to do that process of review. Because we are ultimately talking about a handful of empowered organisations where clearly this legislation will be giving an advantage to. Now, I acknowledge the UK has a similar complaint framework known as the super complaints process, and it was first established in 2003, expanding to other areas such as financial market, police and cybersecurity in subsequent decades. It's been shown to be effective at raising complaints not just concerning individual businesses, but also regarding systemic issues impacting consumers. An example was that from in 2018 when Citizens Advice UK submitted a super complaint regarding conduct of companies in various markets where long-term and existing customers were being penalised and paying more for goods and services. It was like a loyalty penalty. So as a result of the complaint, an investigation was launched uncovering additional conduct, including stealth price rises, costly exit fees, restrictions on switching contracts and unfair auto-renewal processes. and this led to enforcement action against the companies involved, pricing interventions, and a package of reforms, including recommendations to other UK regulators. So I accept that there are concerns that that may be happening in some sectors. So it's likely the proposed ACCC designated complaints function could result in similar broad enforcement and regulatory outcomes. But it also just shows the value of a review amendment being included in the bill to ensure that this new framework is working as intended. Now, there are some issues that still require greater clarity, including, are we sure that the designated organisations will not capitalise commercially to increase their membership because of the added right they gain? And what is preventing designated entities only servicing their one membership, their own membership, rather than taking on board a broader consumer concerns and complaints that may not come from their membership base? And finally, I think we need to look at what's the problem we're trying to solve. And if it is a backlog of caseload for the ACCC, it begs the broader question of is the ACCC sufficiently resourced to play the role it intends and it is necessary for it to do to ensure competition in our consumer markets? And it does beg the question that shouldn't every complainant get a response from the ACCC? What is its resourcing issue and what is the process? So the UK model shows there can be positive outcomes from a framework and a triage process, but I do feel the government could provide greater clarity in its thinking and answers in some of the pertinent questions around what the problem it is trying to solve, what other solutions or options have been looked at, and what the prospects or anticipated outcomes here are. I should say we have a matter of public importance to be debated today around the current price gouging occurring from supermarkets, the monopoly, the duopoly we have when it comes to large supermarket chains and pricing in relation to food in Australia. So consumer and customer choice is incredibly pertinent in the conversation at the moment and in the debate. And the role the ACCC plays in that respect is incredibly important. And so we must make sure that it is sufficiently resourced to look out for consumers and customers and ensure complaints are truly investigated. And in that respect, I'd like to raise the concern of scams, because that's where consumers and customers are very frequently targeted, and there still has yet to be a mechanism that really protects consumers and customers from scams. And again, whether the ACCC is currently has sufficient resources to properly investigate what is happening in that space is really a broad question, and where the responsibility lies. I know many individuals who have been the victims of scams find very little assistance and recourse from the systems and the processes. They are let down by often the financial institutions who wipe their hands of any responsibility. The access to data, getting any kind of investigation into those issues is incredibly difficult. So I would urge the government to do more in relation to protecting consumers and customers in relation to scams.